Okay, so thank you to everyone who is joining us today. We're so happy that you are here. My name is Karen Parkman, and I am the office assistant and receptionist here at WBCA. We are excited to have you tonight for our artist talk, Intro to Spoken Word and Slam Poetry with Tran Myhre. Kyle is a poet, educator, and activist based in Minneapolis, Minnesota. His work explores the relationships between identity, power, and resistance. And he's performed everywhere from the United Nations to music festivals like Eau Claire's and Soundset, to countless colleges, universities, and conferences. He is a two-time National Poetry Slam champion, has also given a TEDx talk, and has published a book, and can currently be heard as co-host of a podcast called What's Good Man, about healthy masculinity. So thanks for being with us, Kyle. We have just a couple housekeeping items before we really launch in. First, I think I see this, everyone's taking care of this, but do make sure you're muted during the talk, just to help with noise in the background. You can turn your camera off or keep it off if you don't want to be visible. You will also get probably the best experience if you're viewing this on speaker mode. So if you go up to the right-hand corner where it says view and click on that, you can switch it to speaker, and then it'll focus on who's speaking rather than all the little squares of the students. If you have a question, let us know using the chat function. You can just say you have a question and Gina or I will unmute you, or you can throw your question in the chat as well. And Kyle will be keeping an eye on that. And just a quick note that if you need closed captioning tonight, it will be available on the recording, but it's not available now for the live talk. So we apologize for that inconvenience. And if you need any assistance or need something repeated, just let us know in the chat. Last thing is to thank our premier business sponsors who help make events like these possible. Boyum Berenshire, Emergency Contractor Services Incorporated, J.L. Schweeder's Building Supply Construction Incorporated, Mueller Memorial, New Studio Architecture, Schweeder's Pottery, the Pillars of White Bear Lake. And we encourage you all to visit the White Bear Center for the Arts website for a complete list of those business sponsors. And this activity is also made possible by the voters of Minnesota through a Minnesota State Arts Board Operating Support Grant, which is a very long title, thanks to a legislative appropriation from the Arts and Cultural Heritage Fund. It is also made possible in part by the Manitou Fund. And your support also makes a difference. So please consider making a donation to WBCA. I will include a link to do that in the chat. So without further ado, I will turn this over to Kyle. Thanks for being here and take it away.
Cool, thank you. I'll go ahead and share my screen. And yeah, feel free, people can let me know if that works. I wanna make sure I can see the chat box at the same time. Okay, here it is. Great. Yeah, if at any point, coming from an educator background, I hate to just like talk at people for an hour straight. So at any point, if people have questions, you can feel free to use the chat box. If you can't hear me or understand me, or if anything is wrong, feel free to let me know. But yeah, otherwise, so we don't have, a ton of people in the space right now, but that's okay, because this will also live later on YouTube or in other ways that people can check it out. And so I would love to both, talk kind of informally with the folks who are here in case you have any specific questions, while also, I don't want to put a bunch of pressure on you to decide where we go in this talk. I do have some stuff prepared and it should be cool. But yeah, just really, really briefly before we get to specific stuff, like, yeah, my name is Kyle. My stage name is Guante. People usually know me as Guante, but please call me Kyle. I've been a spoken word poet for coming on almost like 20 years now. And that's also about the same amount of time I've been a teaching artist. And so going into schools, traveling to a lot of colleges and universities, sometimes talking specifically about poetry and kind of like writing process and encouraging young people to tell their own stories and all that kind of stuff. But more often these days, kind of using poetry and using spoken word as an entry point into talking about other stuff, specifically issues related to identity and power and agency and like social justice. The intro mentioned like the podcast that I did on healthy masculinity. Like we talk a lot about those kinds of issues, gender violence prevention, race and racism, that kind of stuff. And so, today we can talk about some of that. We can not talk about that. We can go in whatever direction people want to take the conversation. But my thought is I would maybe share a little bit of my work for people who aren't familiar, just because that can be potentially a jumping off point to talk a little bit more deeply about what spoken word is, what that term refers to, what slam poetry is, that kind of thing. I also want to make sure that we talk a little bit about like the roots and the foundations of spoken word, not just as like a thing that people do, but as a cultural practice. Like, where does it come from? What is it indebted to? And then I want to share a bunch of resources for people who are trying to get into it. Because I think we're going to come back to this, but one of like the fundamental pillars of how I understand spoken word is that it's very much a participatory, democratic, interactive art form. It isn't just for a handful of like brilliant experts to be famous. It's for everybody to show up to the open mic or the poetry slam or the online video space and tell their story and share what's important to them. Yeah, we'll come back to that in a second. One thing I like to do a lot when I'm in real life spaces, not that this isn't real life, but you know what I mean, when I'm in a classroom or whatever, is not start with what I wanted to start with, but really just ask this idea of guiding questions. And yeah, as I'm talking, if one pops into your head right away, feel free to use the chat box. But the idea is that like these might be questions that we don't necessarily answer right now in the moment. We might not answer them at all, but they're questions that can help steer where the conversation goes. And I think that concept of guiding questions is particularly important for spoken word, because to kind of acknowledge an elephant in the room. And again, I'm not making the participants, we're not going to go around and like, everyone say your name and tell me why you're here, because I don't want to put any pressure on you. Because some people, I know I tune into Zoom stuff sometimes, I just want to relax and watch. So again, you can share that if you want to in the chat, but I'm not going to make you. But as I was saying, I think some people come into a space to talk about spoken word with this kind of, I guess the phrase that I used was elephant in the room, and that I think spoken word and slam poetry, compared to other kinds of art, like novel writing and film and photography and dance and theater, I think they have a lot of baggage in the form of stereotypes. Even though spoken word is this incredibly like popular, dynamic, artistic and literary movement that like thousands and thousands of people across this country and across the whole world are taking part in, in pop culture, in academia, in online spaces, there's definitely this kind of like archetype or this archetypal idea of what a spoken word poet is, or what a slam poet sounds like, right? It's very often like it's loud, it's not very good or well-crafted poetry. It's kind of simplistic in its politics. Again, like the stereotype is like some college kid up on a stage ranting and raving about the revolution while like bongo drums play in the background. It's a weird mix of different stereotypes and different images from different eras, but it's been really persistent in an interesting way. And I think part of that persistence might be is because sometimes there's a truth to it, right? Like when we talk about spoken word as a democratic art form, as a participatory art form, I think part of that is that it's not all good. And like, it doesn't have to all be good, because, every kind of art isn't all brilliant, right? But I think with spoken word, because it's a democratic art form, we see more of the stuff that maybe isn't to our liking or whatever. But we can come back to that too. I also think that some of these stereotypes are very much related to race and related to class. When people see who are the people who are doing spoken word, it's a movement that is driven by young people, and driven particularly by young people who hold various underrepresented or misrepresented identities. And, it's easy to see how the race and class kind of isms would come into that in terms of people's stereotypes or perception of what spoken word is. And, maybe this is just all stuff that I bring with me, and maybe none of you have any of these perceptions, and that's beautiful. But again, I like to just acknowledge that elephant in the room while I ask the idea of like guiding questions. When you hear the term spoken word, when you hear the term slam poetry, are there any questions that pop into your head? And feel free to use the chat box. And if they're not, that's okay too. The ones that I put on the slide here are kind of like FAQ, like frequently asked questions that people have. But I like to at least create space for that. And sometimes, in a small group as well, like sometimes people might show up and are really, really interested in the craft side of like, I am a spoken word poet and I want to make my work more powerful. Like, what are some thoughts about that? And then some people are more interested in kind of the history and the foundational side. And I mean, we'll talk a little bit about both today, but again, just to get a sense of where people are at, feel free to put anything in the chat box.
I mean, I can chime in just with like, I do, when I hear slam poetry, I feel I have a limited but much bigger understanding of it now than I used to. But I think an early image that pops in my head is like some college kid with a beret and like one, spotlight on them, just saying sort of nonsense words in a way that sounds artistic. And it's like an image I feel like I got from a couple Disney movies, maybe, or like cartoons. And I know that that's not it, but definitely that slam poetry has that connection to that image from early on for me.
Yeah, it was always a beret. I think that connects to the Beat generation, right? If people know the history of like literary and artistic movements in the US, like the berets and bongo drums come from that era kind of. And I've been to 1,000 poetry slams featuring people from all walks of life and all different corners of the country, and I've never seen that in real life. Now, and if that is someone's like shtick, like that's awesome, but I've never seen it. And then I see in the chat box, I know nothing about spoken word or slam poetry, which is why I'm here, which is great. Like, I appreciate you for saying that, but also for being here, because as I mentioned, so much of my own work is like using spoken word to talk about other stuff. I very rarely get a chance just to like kind of nerd out about spoken word as a medium, as a form, as a cultural practice. And there's so much cool stuff that we can talk about. Yeah, and that I want to have a greater understanding of the art form and how it developed. Great. Yeah, I appreciate that question too, because oftentimes people don't want that. They just want to like, how do I go viral? How do I become a famous poet or whatever? But like to really understand the foundations is so important.
Kyle, I have a question too that I'm hoping we can go over, which is how when I differentiate spoken word and poetry, I always think that obviously there's a performative element there that is not always present in all poetry. So how much does the performance play into your writing process?
Cool. That's a question that it gets at the craft side of things, and maybe gets at like this deeper idea of like the oral tradition and all that. So yeah, I'm making notes of what people are saying here, and I think we will end up covering a lot of this organically. And then what is your favorite poem that you've written and why? Ooh, okay. Yeah, well, and that's something that if we have time, maybe I'll share it at the end, but otherwise I'm going to share a bunch of links and resources at the end. And then for people who are watching on YouTube 1,000 years in the future, I'll send them somewhere and maybe they can get posted in the info box or something. That's great. These are good. It's a good set of kind of directions on where we can go from here. And well, like I said, looking at these questions, I think one of the easiest ways to get into it, and I know this is an artist talk, it's not just a performance, but I figured I would share an example of my own work because it's a poem that one speaks to a little bit of what we're talking about. It's kind of in Ars Poetica, and it's a poem kind of about poetry and all that, and about spoken word specifically. But I think we can also use the poem as a jumping off point to dig into some of these other questions, if that's cool. So this is exciting. This is a new poem that is not on the internet anywhere yet. Very few people have heard it. It's in my new book, which is coming out not until March. It's coming out on March 1st. But I won't set it up too much. I'll just read it. And the artwork there is from the book. It's by an artist named Casper Fahm. But this is called, oops. Okay. Also, spoken word is very much a full body art form. I would normally be on stage, lots of like hand motions, movement. This is a little bit different, but I think you can still get the most of it. It's called Poem for the First Day of the Poetry Unit in Language Arts Class. Not everyone who studies the sky has to become a begoggled balloon pilot. Some just like looking at the clouds because they're pretty. Some are more concerned with weather patterns and their effects on crops. Some are just charting a course from point A to point B, a matter of routine. It is okay if you don't like poetry. I don't really like the sky. The sun gives me a migraine, wind blows in my face, it snows on days I don't want it to snow. You will never find me in the gondola of a hot air balloon 1,000 paces from where I should be pacing. But language has made me weightless, if only for a moment. A poem once or twice has guided me home. So I want to say something like, when your teacher makes you write a poem, don't think of it as an assignment, think of it as an opportunity. But that's kind of corny. A lot of things that are true are kind of corny, and this isn't a very good poem. I wrote it today, and yeah, it would be better if it were better, but sometimes you see a stage and it's the sky waiting for you to scream something alive into it. So tell your story. Whether it rhymes or not, tell the truth. Whether it gets a good grade or not, write something that means something to you. Even if you don't perform it or publish it or share it with anyone, poetry is not just how elegantly we can put some words next to some other words. Think of all the things with which you could quilt a balloon into being. The flags of 100 nations, the banners of 100 warriors, the baby blankets of 100 lost children. But no matter how beautiful or colorful or well constructed the balloon itself is, none of that makes it fly. In this class, we will study the balloon. We will read old maps, but your job is not just to look up and imagine, it is to look down and laugh. Your job is not just to understand flight, it is to fly. Because you, I would guess, are more than whatever container currently holds you, more than the scraps from which you have been sewn together. And the poem you write does not have to be the first step on some illustrious career as a professional poet. The poem does not have to, quote unquote, save anyone. The poem does not even have to be good. Let it be honest. And let that be enough. Let it say, this is who I am, and this is what I believe. And let that fill as much space as it can. Rise off the ground and meet the sky. The first poem I ever wrote was about the end of the world. And I'm old enough now to have lived through the end of many. I don't remember the words, just a landscape for the dark cloud in me to rain upon. Just the feeling of rising through that cloud and for the first time, seeing the stars beyond it. I don't remember the words, but I remember the light. And I've been walking in its direction ever since. Cool. So yeah, I imagine wild applause and screaming. And one thing that, again, for the sake of what we're doing tonight, and we don't have a ton of time, I did want to share, however, even if we don't literally walk through it, I wanted to share an activity that I use with students in like poetry classes and stuff that I found to be really, really useful for spoken word. It's related to like a critical response thing that you could find in many types of art and critique. But I think with spoken word specifically, I think a lot about how a poem can be broken down into pieces. Right. So delivery being just stuff about the performance. What do you notice about what the poet does with their voice? Their use of negative space, like pauses and dynamics and getting louder and softer and rhythm and that kind of stuff. But it's also facial expressions. It's also body language. So much communication is nonverbal, even when we don't know that we're noticing it. Right. It's like an internal sense of how we hear someone. And spoken word, I think when it's done as well as possible, like takes advantage of that. In that it isn't just about the content. It isn't just about the form of how it's written. It also is about the performance. And I think so, again, not to dwell too much on the critiques that people have of spoken word, but I do think that sometimes there's this idea that because performance matters, and because delivery matters, that somehow takes away from like the purity, quote unquote, of the poem. And I don't believe that, right? I think performance, this is all about how we communicate, how we tell our stories, how we build community through art. And I think performance can be part of that. The next little box here. So again, with students, we'd sit with each one of these boxes and I'd ask, like, what did you notice? And we'd make a list on the whiteboard and just, because there's no, With form, the question, this is more of a traditional kind of poetry question about like, what did you notice about how the poem was put together? A lot of this comes down to concrete language versus abstract language, like using detail and imagery and the same stuff that you would write, that you would use in any kind of poetry. I wrote there in the thing, the idea of setups and punchlines, which coming from, again, a hip hop background too, like that's part of the writing process is how maybe an image is introduced at the beginning of the poem. And then 2 minutes later, that same image comes back and it's kind of, it works like how a joke setup and punchline works, even if it's not a joke. Metaphors, allusions, kind of all the, personification, onomatopoeia, like those vocabulary words that we learn in language arts class. And then I think the point there also about structure. When I get to, again, to use the phrase nerd out about spoken word, I think a lot about structure, in that so many of us growing up, like going to school, learning about poetry, I feel like what we learn is either that poetry is hyper structured, and that, a haiku has a very specific structure to it. A sonnet has a specific rhyme scheme, specific meter, all of that stuff. So it's very, very structured. Or we learn about poetry as this completely unstructured, like, here are my feelings and I'm just going to throw them on the page. And like, the thing is, I think both ends of that spectrum are both great and valid. Like, I love structured poetry. I love unstructured poetry, but so much spoken word of my own, but then also of like my peers, of people who I grew up with in this community, take a really interesting middle ground around structure, in that there isn't like one specific way to write a spoken word poem. There's no kind of meter map or rhyme scheme map that I can give you. There's complete freedom to be as weird as you want to be, but there are kind of like patterns that people use. You could say formulas, if we wanted to be more negative about it. But yeah, for better or worse, a lot of spoken word poems, I think, follow the arc of a story, right? The introduction, the rising tension, the climax, the resolution. Some spoken word poems rhyme, some don't rhyme. Some are very big and weird and creative. Some are very straightforward, just a person telling their story. And it's all like acceptable. It's all cool. When we get to content, the question, it's a pretty straightforward one. What is the poem about? What is it asking questions about? What is it grappling with? The idea of a thesis statement, which I think maybe in some circles is controversial for poetry. And I think a lot of this is like, no poem or spoken word poem has to have anything on this list. They're just like things to think about, things to notice, things to potentially experiment with. How do we relate to a poem? What questions does it raise? And then the fourth box, I find to be a really interesting conversation, because as artists, I think we're not always taught to think as much about context as maybe we could. And my favorite question around context is, what is the work of the poem? Like, where is the poem maybe going to live in the world? And then what is it going to do in that space? Who's the target audience for it? Who's the likely audience for it? Those kinds of questions. And it just, again, it can change how people hear a poem. And I think the idea of this 4-box framework is that when I think of a spoken word poem, I think about how all 4 of these things, and being intentional and thoughtful about all 4 of these things during the writing process, can create really moving work. And again, I'm not say that my work is super moving, but like when I think of my favorite spoken word poems by other people, they're very thoughtful and intentional about each one of these different things. And I think it's also a good way just to think about like what spoken word is. It's this combination of these different factors. But yeah, any thoughts, questions about that before we keep moving? Cool. Yeah, I want to get back to that question about kind of terminology stuff, but Okay, so I guess I shared that poem partly because it kind of talks about on a meta level what we're talking about tonight. But it could have been any poem. It's just one example of what a spoken word poem can sound like. And I think one of the most important points I'd like to share here is that there, are an endless amount of ways a spoken word poem can look or sound. And I think for me, the most basic definition. And again, I don't try to position myself as an expert or an authority because I think people will have different valid ideas about this question. I'm a practitioner and I'd like to share how I've wrapped my head around this concept, but people can definitely feel free to disagree. So I think sometimes the idea of spoken word poetry is that it's a poem and you say it out loud. And it's that simple and that I think is valid. I think for me, maybe a little bit more precise definition is that it's poetry that is written to be performed, versus a poem that you write and then you happen to go up and perform out loud. It's that during the writing process itself, we are thinking about here's where I'm going to pause, here's where I'm going to speed up a little bit and try to get to this climactic moment in the poem. Here's my choreography that I'm going to do with my hands, that kind of stuff. But yeah, beyond that, and I touched on this a little bit, but there aren't any really specific rules around meter or rhyme schemes or anything like that. Like I said, some spoken word poems are loud and big and theatrical. Some are quiet. Some are weird and abstract. Some are straightforward. They can be as long or short as they need to be. Although a lot of spoken word poems tend to be around 3 minutes long because at poetry slams, which are a specific kind of reading, which we can talk about in a second, there's a 3-minute time limit. And so since so many spoken word poets have kind of come up through the slam system, poems tend to be around that long. But then also think about how pop songs are also around that long. It's the idea of how do you grab someone's attention and make a statement in a very compact amount of time. But yeah, I think a point about all that freedom of form is that it can be intimidating, right? Especially if we're used to writing poems that are almost on some level a kind of fill in the blank, right? When I'm writing a villanelle or a sestina, I know what has to come next, even if I don't know what the specific word is going to be. But I think once we wrap our head around that freedom, it can also be really liberating. It allows people to, I think, express themselves in a very authentic way. I mean, ideally, in a very authentic way of finding their own style and their own voice, figuring out what works for us as writers. And that might be a very long process, but I think that's part of what's fun about it. The idea here of, let me touch on the terminology thing really, really briefly. Spoken word and slam poetry, and I guess the phrase performance poetry are very often used interchangeably. And I think that's okay. It may not be exactly right, but I think I get it. If someone says, oh, I heard a slam poem the other day. If we want to be really specific and precise though, the idea is that spoken word is everything that I've been talking about, poems that are written to be performed out loud. Slam poetry is spoken word that is performed at a poetry slam, which is a reading in which poets are judged by random people in the audience. Literally they get a whiteboard and they can write numbers on their panel and they hold it up at the end of the reading. And the idea of it is invented, in the 80s in Chicago, is that it's supposed to democratize poetry. And we can talk more about slam if people are interested in that, but that's kind of where the terminology thing comes in sometimes. But yeah. I think going back to the slide, or talked about it written to be performed, there's a freedom of form. I think a really interesting or important part of this too is that there's a hybrid form in some ways, and that I think spoken word is absolutely poetry. And it also draws from things like theater and stand-up comedy and jazz, hip hop, kind of rhetoric and oratory, oratory, if that's the term, and storytelling, right? All different kinds of storytelling. And you get to draw from all these different forms. An individual poet gets to decide what their style is based on how they draw from these different forms and just what they come up with on their own too. I've known spoken word poets who are basically, they're rappers, but they're rapping a cappella. And so that's their poem. I know others who come from theater backgrounds who are kind of doing dramatic monologues that they wrote themselves as spoken word poems. I know others who come from hardcore MFA poetry spaces, and they're also performing their work in a way that hopefully can be engaging to people. And I think that idea of recitation versus performance is also a key concept for spoken word. That's not just saying the words of the poem, but it's maybe putting a little bit of that method acting into it, like putting yourself in maybe the emotional place you were when you wrote the poem, or trying to embody the kind of tone of the poem. Just really quick, I know I'm talking a lot here, but the idea of that spoken word is democratic and participatory. It is driven by open mic spaces, poetry slam spaces, and online, well, today at least, online video, in that anyone can show up and share something. Anyone can show up and tell their story. The idea of the poetry slam too is that not only can anyone sign up and share a poem, but anyone random person in the audience can be picked as a judge. Like, you don't have to be an expert with an advanced creative writing degree to say, I like that, or I didn't like that. And, you know, pros and cons of turning poetry into a competition, but the kind of democratic impulse is cool. A term that's really important to me is counter narrative. I think a lot of spoken word, even though there aren't any rules about what poems can be about, you know, you can write a spoken word poem about literally anything in the universe. A lot of spoken word, as a cultural practice, is people telling their stories. The counter narrative impulse of saying that, like, you know, to use myself as an example, a lot of my work is around masculinity. Say that, like, well, society and media and commercials and music tells me that in order to quote unquote be a real man, I have to look like this and act like this and talk like this. Here's a poem about why that doesn't work for me, or here's a poem about my process of working through that kind of pressure. And like I said, counter narrative is an important point too, because spoken word is so much driven by young people who don't often get to tell their stories, or whose stories aren't often validated by the larger culture. And on top of young people, so often driven by young people who, like I said, hold misrepresented identities or underrepresented identities, or identities that get stereotyped and are subject to harm in larger, like, popular discourse. And I think that's really important. And then, you know, I know there was the question about kind of the foundational stuff, and I wish we had a whole, not just, you know, 5 hours, but like a whole semester to really dig into it. But I think the idea of an ancient lineage, the idea that for a lot of people, spoken word and slam poetry are seen as very new things, like kind of cool, countercultural, like new way of understanding poetry, or new way of understanding the poet's relationship to the audience via the stage versus via the page. And I think there's some truth to that, in that what most people think of as spoken word and slam poetry is what they think of from kind of the last couple of decades, like from the 90s, basically. Slam was invented in the 80s, like we can talk about that. But at the same time, spoken word is, you know, the oldest art form that human beings have, or one of the oldest art forms that human beings have. I think a lot about, just a couple of reference points. I think about this idea of tracing back a lineage. And this is, I say a few reference points in the slide, because obviously there's so much more that we could touch on here. But I think about how when I work with, say, a young person today, a high schooler, around spoken word, very often their first exposure to spoken word will be via, I wrote viral online poetry, but, like, you know, spoken word up on YouTube. I'll share some links at the end to a good kind of databases for that. They'll see something, a friend will share it on social media. They'll maybe fall into a rabbit hole of watching different people's poems. But, you know, that can be traced back through how social media over the past 10 years has developed as a culture, its own kind of culture. We can trace back further through a specific show that was on HBO called Def Poetry Jam, which was, I think, for, you know, a little bit of an older, maybe my generation, our first exposure to spoken word was very often through that show, having some of the top practitioners at the time come and read their poems out loud on a stage. You can trace that back through kind of the slam genesis in the 80s and 90s, and the early, like, national poetry slams that happened, some of the early, like, trailblazers in the scene. That, I think, is connected very much. Again, it's not a perfect connection. None of this is like, this isn't necessarily a linear A plus B equals C straight line, but it's about taking these different bubbles of, again, literary artistic movements and seeing how they all bubble together to create this other thing. Because the next point on there is hip hop culture. And I think sometimes hip hop and spoken word get conflated as the exact same thing, but I think how they've grown as distinct cultures has really been in conversation with each other. I think hip hop is an enormous part of where spoken word is today. That is not to say that every spoken word poem or poet draws from hip hop in the same way. Like sometimes it's an explicit kind of reference, sometimes it's an implicit thing. But then again, you could trace then hip hop back through the Black Arts Movement. We talk about, or even before that, like Gil Scott-Heron, right? Or the Last Poets. But then, through the Black Arts Movement, through the Beat Generation, like Amiri Baraka, Allen Ginsberg, that kind of stuff, through jazz, the Harlem Renaissance, and on and on and on. Like I said, all these different kind of artistic and literary movements that I think spoken word today draws from. And at the end of that line, for me at least, you would get to this idea of the storyteller, the person whose job in a particular society or village or place is to pass on the history of the people or the values of the people through stories. And, most often through orally, through stories, sitting around a fire, talking to each other, not through written language. And almost every culture on earth has some version of that, right? Like the word I put here is the griot, which I think is specifically a West African term. And I think that is maybe the most important like vocabulary word here. But I think we can also connect it to stuff like, the Iliad and the Odyssey were not created to be read by people. They were songs. A poet would travel around, Homer would travel around and like sing the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? The kind of bardic tradition, to use like European examples, or like is it Skjold, the kind of Scandinavian version, but across the Americas and Asia and Africa, all around the world, there are different versions of this similar thing of like, it is so important for us, both as individuals, but also as communities, to tell our stories. And share our stories with each other and grow as people together. And I think, even when spoken word poets today aren't familiar with that history, we're still taking part in it in some way. And so I think that's at least a good introduction to the idea of what the history and the foundations are for me. So much more that could be said there, but if any of those terms are new for anybody, you can feel free to take a screenshot and Google stuff later. But yeah, there's more I have to share, but we could stop for a second to see if there's any other questions or thoughts so far. I'm still going to come back to that question of my own favorite poem.
Kyle, do you find that like in terms of poetry created on the internet or going viral, is that community happening a lot on YouTube, Instagram, or is it kind of across social media that you're seeing this stuff pop up?
Yeah, so I'm gonna be disciplined and not go off on too much of a tangent about like the pros and the cons of how poetry has engaged in the virtual space. Because it's a long conversation. And I think generally it's cool stuff. I see, on Instagram, even though a lot of the poetry that gets shared with me on Instagram, I actually don't like just as for my own taste, like it's not poetry that I think doesn't speak to me. I'm maybe not the target audience for it, but I love the idea that millions of people are sharing poems via Instagram. And they're becoming doorways and gateways for people into the world of poetry. And I think that's really cool. From my own experiences, mostly with YouTube, which again, for people who, whether you don't know, or maybe you're watching this on some other thing a million years in the future, but YouTube just being a space where lots of people can upload videos of themselves, right? And I think some spoken word poets do that on an individual level. What's been really cool about YouTube is seeing channels develop where those channels will share multiple different voices of people doing spoken word. The example I'm going to share at the end of the presentation is Button Poetry, which is actually based in Minnesota. Got their start in the slam scene here in the Twin Cities, and then became a place where they travel around the country, they film poetry slams and other poetry events, and then basically every day just post one new video. And so it's an incredible way to see kind of like snapshots of what practitioners are doing right now. but they're also a publisher. They do a bunch of cool stuff. But there are other channels like that online too. And I think, it's allowed poets like me to spread our work in ways that traditional kind of avenues of publishing maybe hasn't been able to do as much. I can say I make a living as a poet today. And a lot of that is directly related to online video. A student at a college will see one of my videos, they'll go talk to like a staff person or a professor or whatever, and then they'll reach out to me and then I'll come and speak on campus, like that kind of thing. So that's been really cool to see. It's probably too early to tell how like healthy it is for poetry. Like I don't want to say anything apocalyptic about it, but what I said earlier about spoken word being a very democratic art form means that, yeah, a lot of it is bad. You'll go to a poetry slam or an open mic, and not every poem that goes up is going to be a brilliant, like life-changing thing. But I also think that's kind of what's beautiful about the culture, in that like at a given event, it was a little bit of a tangent, but at a given event, like you might see someone who is a pillar of the artistic community perform a poem right next to someone who is, 14-year-old kid trying this out for the very first time in their lives, right next to someone who has a day job and is just doing this just as a fun little hobby. And like, I think all of that is really cool. I would love to see a world in which everyone shares their poems, whether they call themselves a poet or not, or whether they are published or not. There's a space for people to really share. And I think, to bring it back to the original question, the internet is one way to help facilitate that. Cool. Well, maybe I can keep it moving, and then there'll still be a little bit of time at the very end for questions too. I know we're closing in on it. I thought I might, if it's cool, share another poem. And I think I wanted to share this is a shorter poem, but I wanted to share something that touches on that counter narrative thread a little bit more directly. The first one did too, but yeah, it's like another new poem from the new book that I'm just excited to share. So I figured I would, if that's okay. And this is called Wolves, They Said, Prayer Like. And I should say really, really quickly, you're not supposed to like introduce the poem, you're supposed to just do it. But I will say that the new book that I have coming out in March was conceptual in the sense that it's not a book of poems like by me talking as me. The whole book is written in character, and it's multiple characters on a planet that is not the Earth. And so like it's dealing with all kinds of like real world issues, but I really wanted to try something that was a little more science fictional, I should say. And so, yeah, I won't explain everything about it, but just that the poem that I'm sharing now and the poem I shared earlier are not from my voice. And I think people who study poetry know that like voice and poet are not the same thing, but just in case that isn't super clear. But yeah, so it's called Wolves, They Said, Prayer Like. It wasn't that the fence would cost too much or take too long to build. The men of the village just looked past us, past where the fence would be, into the great forest itself. Wolves, they said, prayer like, night after night. Packs of vicious wolves leave the cover of the great forest to raid the farms just outside the village, taking sheep and hogs, dozens of the beasts, stinking of blood so large they'll look you straight in the eye. They come and they kill our sheep, our hogs, and they disappear back into that endless whispering hell. We offered to start building the fence immediately, as this was still a relatively new settlement, and our bosses figured they could curry favor with the people here by providing some basic protection. We knew right away, though, as our proposal hung in the air around the bonfire, these men would politely but firmly decline. We'd seen it before, this hunger. These men, always men, carrying their grandfather's swords, brittle from the rejection of their own softness. They didn't want to prevent the wolves from taking their livestock. They wanted to punish them. They would form hunting parties. They would sharpen spears and string bows, both useless in woods that dense, and these men would march straight into that darkness. The root of this kind of zealotry is always a story. Sometimes it's a story about how men are strong and strength always wins. Sometimes it's a story about how men are weak but can become strong through suffering. Sometimes it's a story about how terrifying it is to be alone, how important it is to go along. It's never a story anyone actually tells. It lives like a parasite in the margins of other stories, innocent stories of adventure and escapism of men, always men, overcoming long odds, winning through sheer force of will and righteousness, men killing their enemies. The stories are tricks. The hardest man is softer than a dull blade, a shovel, a mouthful of teeth, rugged becomes ragged so easily, strong becomes inflexible, tough becomes gristle. A single-minded enemy is easy to predict, to hunt. All these qualities we see as weapons, they're just weight, no use in the brush we move through. Too many men see wolf and think dog, think weak, familiar creature that cowers to a raised voice. Too many men see ourselves and think wolf, taste the blood between our teeth and assume it once belonged to prey. So yeah, and again, if this were a classroom or if we had an endless amount of time, we could break that down. We could talk about how it's, about masculinity, how it's about kind of punishment. Maybe it's a metaphor for like the prison industrial complex. But yeah, and all of that is true. But I think a key objective in the poem for me was touching on that idea of a counter narrative, about the stories that we tell and the stories that we kind of ingest, whether we know we're ingesting them or not. And that's such a key important part for me of understanding spoken word. Again, not just as the act of going up and performing a poem, but as a cultural practice that like thousands and thousands of people all over the world are taking part in. This idea of how do we tell our own stories and tell the truth, but also tell different stories than the stories that we were raised with, or the stories that maybe do not serve us in ways that we need them to. It's also just on a form level, right? Because this is kind of a craft talk. I could imagine a poetry professor reading this and being like, well, it's not, is it really poetry? And that, that question, like, what is poetry, is maybe above my pay grade. But again, I think spoken word can take bits of prose and bits of monologue and bits of poetry and hopefully just create something that can like live in a cool way or in an interesting way. And I hope the poem does that. But yeah, and this is actually the last slide, and we can kind of, again, this can be pretty informal from here on out, but I wanted to make sure to share it, in the spirit of that idea of spoken word being a democratic participatory art form, just different ways to potentially dive in. And I see the question in the thing too. I'll get to that in a second, but just really quick, just for the slide, True Art Speaks is an organization that I work with. They're based in Minnesota, and they do a ton of kind of residency work in schools, high schools and middle schools, but also run a free all ages open mic every week, annual youth poetry slam series, like a tournament series that happens. And all of that is, if you Google True Art Speaks, it's trueartspeaks.org, you can find it. Again, if any of you are young people or know young people who are interested in that kind of stuff, Button Poetry, I mentioned earlier, a Minnesota-based publisher, both their YouTube channel, which is just, YouTube, type in Button Poetry, and there are thousands of high quality audio and video spoken word poems. And then they're also a publisher. My new book is coming out via Button Poetry. And then I have a link in my website, in the resources page of my website, guante.info, that has a very specific, I actually have a copy here. I made a zine, which is like a little booklet, of just resources for like aspiring spoken word poets, just different ways. Like if you're, I talk about young people a lot, but even if you're not a young person, if you're just a person and you want to get involved, like how do you do that? And some of it is like, you show up, go to a open mic, a poetry slam. Here's a list of a few of them. Different places to read spoken word poets' work, because even though we perform, like reading is still the most important thing we can do as artists, as poets at least, is read. Different video channels, different podcasts, that kind of thing, different organizations people should know about. I made a list too of my 10 favorite spoken word poems by other people. And then I had to shout out White Bear Center for the Arts too. And that's an important thing. But yeah, this is at I said, at my website on the resources page, there's a digital version of this whole little booklet. And then that's a really cool question too. Because I'm familiar with Tor.com, but the status quo doesn't require world building. So is there lots of world building in spoken word? I love that question because I've just gotten out of this multi-year long process of world building for the new book, which, like I said, takes place somewhere else and is in all different characters' voices and incorporates visual art. And like I had to work with the visual artists to like build this kind of world. And it was super fun to me. But I think just as a super straightforward answer, I think generally, no. I think a lot of, well, I mean, it depends on how we define world building. I'm thinking of it in kind of like the sci-fi, like speculative sense, because, you know, there's always building the world of the poem. But I think, however we take that term, I think a lot of spoken word, and this I think is a good thing, it's not a critique. A lot of spoken word is about dealing with the world as it is. It's about saying that this is my story, this is my reality. I don't see myself, and I'm not speaking as myself, but a lot of people are saying like, I don't see myself reflected on the news or whatever. So here, I'm gonna tell my story. It's been a really cool space for people to, I think, find community. Community is such an overused kind of abstract term, if we want to do a whole concrete versus abstract lesson here, but I think in a very real way, spoken word and spoken word spaces have been places where people can build community. When people tell their stories, and maybe they just did it for themselves, for their own kind of catharsis, but then other people hear that and they suddenly don't feel so alone in the universe. And like, that's really cool. I would like to see more world building in spoken word though. I'd like to see, now that, yeah, that's kind of, my new book is kind of potentially an offering in that direction of how can we reflect what's going on and talk honestly about things we've been through or things that are happening in the world, but how can we also do that in new ways and new and engaging ways, not because it's better than the old ways, but just because it's a challenge. And I think that's fun. And then,
Go ahead.
Oh, no.
Go ahead, finish up your thought. That's okay.
I was going to transition into the last little thing anyway.
Okay, well, of course, just being an art center, we work a lot with visual artists, and I'm just really fascinated when you were talking about collaborating with a visual artist on your book. Could you speak a little bit more about that process, and did the poetry inform the art, or did how did that collaboration work?
Yeah, it's been really fun. And like I was saying a second ago, like, I want to say there was more intention behind it, but I really just wanted to work with a visual artist because most poets don't, right? Like obviously some do, and I'm not the first to ever do it, but you know, I'd never done it before. I thought it would just be a fun challenge. And I went through a painstaking amount of research of digging through people's kind of online portfolios, talking to artist friends who I know in real life and seeing if they had any, you know, connections or whatever. I actually talked to an artist friend named Tran, who wrote The Magic Fish, which was like a bestseller. He's also from Minnesota, but about kind of the process of like, how do you book an artist? What is an insulting amount of money to pay versus what is way too much? And like just those kind of technical questions. And so that was a lot of fun. And then also having a publisher helped too, just in terms of like the resource end of it. But I think the fun creative part was so much of in poetry, we're taught so much that, you know, you show, you don't tell. You have to use imagery. You have to use detailed, concrete imagery to bring the poems to life. And like, could visual art in some sense be like a shortcut or like a cheat? I could see that, but I also see it as going back to this slide about how all the about how all the different pieces of the poem come together to create this like thing. I tried to, you know, you could add another square there, which would be like the visual art side, at least in this case. And that was really, really rewarding. I think even if people don't like my poetry, I think the book is going to be just beautiful. And I think that you know, is important. And it reflects kind of the world building in the book too, and that the kind of sketch style. This is the idea that these are yeah, I don't want to go into too much of what the book actually is, but that it's kind of a sketchbook of over the course of many months. Yeah. And I was I know there's that question about what is the favorite poem that I wrote. I won't perform it, but I do, at my website, this is a good way to plug my website, Guantera.info. It has a poetry tab, which has basically all the poems that I've done, links to like my YouTube channel. There's a grid of them there, but then if you go to my YouTube channel, there's a million more of them. I think if I'm proud of anything, it's probably, it's such a hard question, especially as a Midwesterner where we're not supposed to like be proud of ourselves. But I think, so I have a poem, one of the first poems I wrote, which you don't often say to, because most of the times I hate everything that I wrote more than 6 months ago. But an earlier poem that I wrote was about my last job, or not my last job, my first job out of college. I was a janitor, and I wrote a poem partly about that experience, and kind of, again, on like the world building, like detailed concrete imagery side of it, just about that experience of being a janitor, but also being able to dig into the whole idea of work and what is work, and like, I think one of the most important functions of poetry is that it's a space to stop and think about something that we think we already understand and try to think about it in a deeper way, right? And so growing up, I thought of work as like, it's work, you just do it, right? It's a thing that you do. And then, going to college for 4 years, getting my creative writing degree, and then becoming a janitor, it was a great opportunity to really dig into like, what is the value of work, and what is the dominant narrative that society is trying to teach us about or tell us about work, and how can we find value in ourselves and in our communities outside of what we do for a living and all that. But the poem is called The Family Business. Yeah. But cool. And I think we're, kind of getting towards the end here. If there are any other thoughts or questions. We covered a lot of ground here. I hope it was at least an entry point for people to like explore more.
Thank you so much, Kyle. We really look forward to continuing to work with you in the future. So people who are watching this, stay tuned for further collaborations. Hopefully, we're looking for opportunities to continue that. And thanks so much for being here.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. This is really cool.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kyle. Thanks to all the audience members. There will be a recording of this if you want to go back through and look at the slides and go back over any of the materials. That will be available soon. But I think that brings us to the end. So thanks so much, everybody. And we'll go ahead and wrap up. Thanks for being here.